Thank you. Well, thank you, Matt. What I will try and do in, as Matt has suggested, bringing some of these threads together, is to start, if I may, with an observation about us, all of us, human beings. And I think one of the most sort of agonizing features of the human condition, and it's a universal dilemma, is that we all crave stability, tranquility, predictability, and yet we all live in a world which is overwhelmed by constant and churning change. And that sort of tension between our wish, our longing for stuff to sort of stand still, but the fact that the world around us moves at a dizzying pace is not new. It's not new. Societies have had to cope with complete convulsions, technology-driven convulsions in the past. It's always created winners and losers, hopes and anxieties, and a lot of sort of ructions along the way when we had to prepare ourselves and our society and our economy and our homes for the age of oil, for the carbon-fueled economy. It changed everything, from the way we heated our homes to the way we transported ourselves from place to place. When we had to ready ourselves for the age of electricity, we erected pylons, we connected cables from place to place, and now, of course, we're having to do it all over again as we enter into the age of data, in which data will become the lifeblood, the elixir of so much of what we do. So change in technological change is not new, but arguably the pace of it certainly is. Google, thank you Google for hosting this wonderful event, is what, 20 years old? Facebook is only 14 years old. They're very, very young companies, and yet they also already have such a universal impact. And if you look right back at history, you'll find that every time people are confronted with change, or indeed with new machines, it elicits fear. Aristotle warned about the danger that machines would pose to the way of life that he inhabited back then. Elizabeth I withheld a patent for a knitting machine, I think it was, because of the fear that she had about the impact that it would have on her poor, long-suffering subjects. The Luddites, of course, destroyed machinery, factory machinery, because they were so alarmed about the impact that it would have on their lives. In 1964, a panel of intellectuals produced a report for President Lyndon Johnson, I scribbled this down earlier, where they warned that what they called the cyber nation revolution would lead to millions and millions of people losing their jobs. So fear of change, fear of machinery, fear of its displacing effect on us all is not new. But I think the pace and sheer scale of it arguably is. And here's the bit where I deliver some tough messages to those who come from a world of politics and those who come from a world of tech. I don't think we're navigating this new chapter of technology-driven change very well at all. And I think the blame for that is equally shared by what I call these worlds of technology and politics, who are increasingly acting like worlds sort of talking past each other, ships passing in the night, where there is a growing spirit and atmosphere of mutual suspicion, fear, even loathing between the two. And if we get this wrong, and if we let that escalate, in other words, if people who are elected by millions of folk across the democratic world to try and do the right thing by society as a whole, continue or increasingly view what I would regard as a sort of innately optimistic liberal as the progressive promise of technology as a existential threat instead, I think the consequences could be negative, disruptive, and will rob us all of the great advances that technology can bring for us all, culturally, economically, clinically, socially, and so on. And let me just characterize, and this is, I accept, nothing more in the very brief time I have with you, a caricature. But I was in California last week. I was giving some talks at Stanford University, and many of you might hail from there or come from there, or your careers might have been built there. You know it probably much better than I do. And I was, like everybody, like every occasional visitor to California, buoyed up, certainly compared to the ghastly, backward-looking, Brexit-addled debate in this country, buoyed up by the optimism, the sort of future-looking, future-facing spirit of the place. But I was also reminded in various conversations by that kind of lurking and persistent mixture of naivety, arrogance, and sort of libertarianism, which I think stems, totally understandably, from a generation of people who say, look, I invented this remarkable thing in my T-shirt in my garage in Palo Alto. Leave me alone, you politicians, you regulators, society at large. We'll fix it. That's what engineers do. They fix stuff, and they want to be left alone so they can fix it. And so much though I think the mood has changed, and I'll come to it in a minute, there's still that slight sort of sense of, we've done this remarkable thing, it's having this transformative effect. The last thing we want is governments and politicians getting their sort of dirty mitts and messing it all up. And then if you go to the political side of the equation, you have ignorance, profound ignorance about what technology does or doesn't offer. And with ignorance, of course, because people are always more fearful of things they don't understand, a great deal of fear as well. Turbocharged by some good old-fashioned vested interests, particularly in the old-fashioned newspaper industry, who of course want to destroy a lot of these particular social media upstarts because they're draining all their advertising revenue away. So they constantly stoke the politicians up to beat up, particularly on the social media giants, but on technology as a whole. And I think that is creating a dangerously curdled, negative atmosphere in which those two worlds of technology and politics, which should be working in harness and collaboratively to deal with some of the collective problems we're facing, are instead at best speaking past each other, or at worst simply taking pot shots at each other. So I guess the question I really want to pose to you, and I'll offer some of my own answers, or sort of venture some suggested answers, how do we go about avoiding those two worlds getting locked in a position of sort of permanent or semi-permanent animosity towards each other? And I have one message for the tech world, if I can put it like that, rather breezily, and one message for the political world. And both of them would make me equally unpopular in both, but I'm quite a specialist in delivering unpopular messages. So the first one is to the tech world, is this. I think, and I'm not saying it to you, but since we're at Google, I think it would be a good thing just to dampen down a bit of the utopianism about the future and focus a bit more instead on problems which exist today. And let me perhaps explain to you that by way of an anecdote. I remember a couple of years ago speaking to one of the most brilliant minds in the field of artificial intelligence and machine learning. One of the most, I'll leave him nameless, but one of the most globally recognized authorities on all of this. And it was just after, I think, he and other sort of leading luminaries of Silicon Valley had gone to the World Economic Forum in Davos, which meets every year, to say very loudly that governments should prepare themselves to introduce a universal basic income. This idea that a universally funded income should be provided so that people are well supported regardless of whether they work or not, and in a sense can be at home contented even if workless, supported by this universal basic income. And I said to him, so is it true that artificial intelligence and machine learning is going to displace labor and render so many millions of people workless in the way that was presented as the reason why governments needed to now start thinking about universal basic income? He said, no, not at all. We have absolutely no idea. It's perfectly possible, as has been the case almost every time with previous technological innovations, that just as much as technology can disrupt or even diminish certain jobs, it creates others. That's been pretty well the consistent pattern from the agricultural revolution, where close to 100% of us used to work on the fields, and now close to 100% of us work in the cities, to ATMs, to all sorts of previous. No, he said, not at all. But he said, no, but it's such a good idea, isn't it? It's a good idea in and of itself. Now, look, I have to betray, or admit perhaps, to an old-fashioned, rather unreconstructed liberal view that I think work is indispensable to people's sense of self-worth and identity and self-respect. And I think this idea that there's some utopian future where we all sort of float around and don't really work and sort of feel happy and it's all paid for by somebody else, I don't buy it. But setting my own prejudices aside, I said, well, I'd be a little bit careful if I were you. Because if you say to a bunch of politicians, who are anyway rather befuddled and confused by what on earth you're up to, by the way, we've come up with this really new whiz-bang technology which you can't really understand, but it's going to render millions of the people you represent unemployed, and then you have to find the money to keep them happy at home. I said, they'll close you down. He said, really? Well, of course they will. And it was conversation like that made me realize that that the gap between those two worlds is one which is potentially very corrosive and needs to be replaced with a little less focus on what might happen the day after tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, some utopian future in which, a bit like a sort of latter-day version of Marxism, the internal contradictions of capitalism and the remorseless march of technology will suddenly render us into a sort of different species in which work and all the stresses and strains of everyday 9-to-5 life will drop away. I think we need to spend a little less time on that and a little more time on issues that we know are confronting society now. We know from study after study after study that whilst technology did not remotely invent inequality in developed capitalist economies, it does, frankly, seem to play a role in exacerbating it. We know that the hollowing out of middle-ranking jobs, in other words, neither highly qualified jobs nor very low-qualified jobs, was not invented in Silicon Valley, not invented by technology. It's been a growing part of labor markets in developed capitalist economies for some time. But it does appear to be a trend, that polarization between well-rewarded, highly qualified work and badly rewarded, low-qualified work, which is being dramatically exacerbated by technology. We were told that technology always brings about a boost in productivity. Doesn't actually, so far, necessarily appear to be the case. Look at this country. This country is one of the more digitally conversant economies in the developed world, and yet productivity has pretty well stagnated year after year after year in recent times. And so, sorry to give a rather sort of blunt, pragmatic, undreamy prescription, but I think the kind of questions we should be asking ourselves is how do we provide our fellow citizens with the training and the retraining and the lifelong learning so that they can develop new skills as they move through life to take up those better qualified jobs? How do we introduce what they call in parts of Scandinavia flex security, so that even as you move from one job to the next, you at least still have security in doing so? How do we crack the conundrum of stagnant productivity? Those are the nitty-gritty, here today problems which drive a lot of social, economic anxiety and a great deal of political populism too. It's not the fault of great technology companies like Google, not remotely, and I'll come to that in a minute. But by golly, it would help if we could talk about those issues more rather than some never future where everyone sits at home happily paid for by somebody else. So my message to the tech world is turn the volume a little bit down on the dreamy stuff, on the utopianism about the future, and help address some of those really difficult, quite deep-seated problems today. My message to the world of politics, by contrast, is stop blaming technology, stop blaming tech companies, stop blaming Silicon Valley for every single ill under under the sun. Yes, of course, there are big issues, some of which I'll return to in a minute, on tax, on data sovereignty, on privacy, and so on. But this is becoming, in my view, a sort of semi-hysterical stampede at the moment. If you read many of our newspapers, whether they're broadsheet or tabloid newspapers these days, you'd think that every attack, every crime, every accident, every mishap, all of that can be traced to the feet of the founders of some of the big technology companies in California. If you're a backbench MP in this country and you're trying to make a name for yourself, all you need to do these days, bluntly, is bash out a press release saying, I hurt my toe in the bathroom today and it's Mark Zuckerberg's fault. And you're pretty well guaranteed you'll get full-page coverage in the Daily Mail and large parts of the Murdoch press, because they have an insatiable appetite at the moment to besmirch, however randomly, the name and the purpose of technology in their sort of fight for survival with the social media companies. And this, I think, is very, very dangerous, because that sort of feedback loop between politicians constantly craving approbation and attention and the very powerful, old-fashioned, but nonetheless still extraordinarily influential vested interests in our written press is creating, I think, a kind of spinning washing machine of hysteria and prejudice. I mean, ask yourself, does anyone seriously think that Mark Zuckerberg is a greater threat to the integrity of American democracy than the National Rifle Association, that's spending all its time stymieing any reform of gun laws? Is he more personally answerable for the failings of democracy than, I don't know, big oil? Or the way Rupert Murdoch goes in and out of the White House to wield his unaccountable influence over Donald Trump, or the way Paul Dacre, the ghastly editor of the Daily Mail, goes into number 10 to do the same behind closed doors, no scrutiny, no accountability? Or the hedge fund managers who poured millions of their own money to kind of play Russian roulette, actually possibly almost exactly Russian roulette, with the future of British democracy by funding the anti-European cause in the Brexit referendum? No, of course not. It's become hysterical now, I think, the political debate about the role of technology in society and democracy at large. And so my final remark is really this. If only the two sides could find a way of getting, as I say, a little less utopianism on the one hand, and a little less blame on the other, and could actually start talking to each other to deal collectively with some of the issues which can only be dealt with through collaboration, I think we would all benefit immensely from it. Look at the issue of tax. Very fraught issue. Very fraught issue. The big tech companies, of course, entirely right to say, well, look, we abide by the law. We don't set the law. It's the governments that set the law. We pay what we're due to pay under the law. You governments sort it out. Of course, they're right to say that. But equally, actually, the politicians are not wrong in saying, well, yes, okay, we get that, but in companies now which make so much money across so many jurisdictions, they have this is what governments and politicians say, and indeed I suspect the large swathes of public opinion say, they have a moral as well as a legal duty not to play cat and mouse with the different tax jurisdictions. Both are right, or both are equally right and equally wrong in equal measure. It can only be solved by those two communities coming together to come up with a multilateral and global solution to how you tax so much intangible economic activity taking place on such an unimaginable scale across so many old-fashioned national jurisdictions. Look at the issue of data sovereignty, probably the most important, if impenetrable question of our age. Who owns and controls data? Do we? Do we? Or what point do we forfeit that and give control of data to others? How much right do governments and security services and others have to both scrutinize and inspect and share our data? There are technological innovations, not least blockchain technology, which provide enticing, tantalizing prospects of greater decentralization of the way in which data is handled and much greater transparency in providing a trail by which data is is handled in the first place. Like DeepMind, a Google-owned company, has done some really innovative stuff using blockchain technology to make it very, very transparent exactly how, in real time, data is used in the hospitals with which DeepMind works. But all of those things, and many other issues besides, are only possible if these two increasingly distanced worlds of technology and politics learn to speak to each other. And so my final observation really is that people talk about leadership. I think this session is entitled Leadership in an Age of Technology. And of course, you can stake out positions when you're seeking to lead. But actually, real leadership only ever comes about through a process of collaboration, conversation, and compromise. And that is only possible if we use wonderful facilities like this at the Grove in future to make sure that politicians and technologists properly and tolerantly and with an open mind understand each other. Thank you very much. Very much for time, Maddie.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.